The morning of March 14th, 1994, arrived cold in Harlan County, Kentucky. 29 degrees at first light. The kind of cold that makes clay soil ring like iron when you strike it with a pick. Elias Combs was already on the hillside by 6. He wore the same canvas jacket he had worn since 1981, faded brown, frayed at both cuffs, and he walked the contour of the slope the way a doctor walks a patient's bedside, slowly, looking at everything, touching nothing yet. He carried a hand auger, a small notebook, and a mason jar of water. The hillside rose at a 22-degree above County 401, 38 acres of red clay and 408 acres. Wet clay and exposed subsoil that most men in the county had stopped calling farmland a decade earlier. The topsoil was gone. Sheet erosion had stripped it down to the pale, compacted layer underneath. The kind of ground that sheds water like a tin roof. The kind where seeds sit on the surface and wash downstream in the first hard rain. Elias, 58 years old, with 34 years of farming in his hands, knew every furrow on this slope. He'd been working it since he was 24, back when it still grew burley tobacco. He knew where it drained and where it held. He knew the 2 spring seeps that ran just below the ridgeline in March, and the narrow shelf of darker soil that cut diagonally across the face of the hill like a faded scar. He had watched other men give up on ground like this, watched them overgraze it, then plow it bare, then walk away shaking their heads. He did not plan to walk away. He pushed the hand auger into the slope at the 18-inch mark and pulled a core. He held it to the gray morning light. The subsoil was dense and mineral-rich, the color of old brick. He had seen this profile before. Not on this slope. Somewhere older, in a memory that was not quite his own. He wrote 3 numbers in the notebook, capped his pen, and started down the hill toward the truck. Elias Harlan Combs was born in 1936 in a house that no longer stands, on a ridge above the Paw Fork of the Cumberland River, 4 miles outside of Evarts, Kentucky. His mother was a messer from Letcher County. His mother was a Methkaitki. His father's people had been Combs going back to the 1790s, Scots-Irish settlers who had come through the Cumberland Gap and stopped when they found country that looked like the land they'd left, steep, forested, and hard. His grandfather on his father's side, the one everyone called Old Harlan, to distinguish him from the county itself, was born in 1898 and died in April of 1979, at 81, in the same bed where he'd been born, with no hospital and no fanfare. Old Harlan Combs had farmed hillside ground in Harlan County for 60 years and never once had a level field. The creek bottoms and hollow floors were valuable and contested, and nobody with options farmed the ridges. But old Harlan's family had come to their ground late, and what was left was steep, and he had learned over decades what the Cherokee people who'd worked these hills before European settlement had understood for centuries. That slope ground farmed wrong dies fast. Farmed right, it outlasts anything on flatland. He cut terraces, not with machinery, with a mattock, a broadaxe, and a hand level built from a piece of glass tubing set into a block of walnut wood. He followed the contours of the hill, cut small benches into the face of the slope, packed their inner edges with flat stone gathered from the hillside itself. He burned crop residue and hardwood scraps at the end of every season and worked the char into the soil of each terrace, not primarily as fertilizer, though it helped, but to hold water and slow the leaching of what little organic matter the slope retained. He grew corn and beans and squash together, not in rows but in scattered hills the way the old people had done it, each plant doing something for the soil that the others could not. Elias had done this work beside him from the age of 7. He didn't know it had a name or a history older than the county or older than the country. He only knew the work and the ground and his grandfather's hands. There was one afternoon in the summer of 1961. Elias was 25, beginning his own farming years, and he had been wondering quietly whether all this labor, the hand-cut benches, the slow burns, the old varieties, was worth it when the county extension agent was promoting hybrid seed and commercial fertilizer to every farmer who'd listen. They were cutting a new terrace bench together that day, and old Harlan stopped and pressed his palm flat against the raw subsoil they'd just exposed. He held it there for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. "The ground remembers," he said, "even when it looks like it's forgotten." He picked up the mattock and kept cutting. Elias had carried that line for 33 years without needing to use it the way he was about to. In February of 1994, Elias Combs had applied for a $47,000 operating loan through the USDA Farm Service Agency field office in Harlan, Kentucky. He needed the money to begin what he had mapped out over 2 winters at the kitchen table, a 7-year restoration effort on the 38-acre hillside parcel, using a system of hand-cut contour terraces, deep incorporated biochar amendments, and a specific cover crop rotation, drawn from his grandfather's practice and from what he'd begun to read in old agricultural bulletins. The plan was detailed. The budget was precise. The parcel was classified as severely degraded. The loan was denied on March 2nd. The denial letter was signed by Richard Albright, 52, the regional FSA director based out of Lexington, who had toured Harlan County the previous autumn as part of a federal assessment of underperforming agricultural land in the Appalachian region. Albright had a degree in agricultural economics from the University of Tennessee and 17 years in Federal Farm Credit Administration. He wore khaki in the field and drove a government-issue Ford F-150 that still smelled like the lot. On March 9th, Elias drove to the FSA field office on Central Street in Harlan and asked to speak with the regional director. He was told the decision had been made at the Lexington office. He asked for a direct number. He was given a fax number. He did not own a fax machine. He drove home, wrote a letter by hand, and mailed it that afternoon. A form response arrived 11 days later. He read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and drove to Lexington. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Richard Albright sat across a desk that held nothing personal. No photographs, no plants, just a soil survey map of eastern Kentucky pinned to the corkboard behind him and a coffee mug from a 1991 RCS field day. He had Elias's file open on the desk. "Mr. Combs," he said, "the soil assessment on that parcel puts it at a 6 on the land capability class scale. Class 6 means severe limitations for sustained production. We don't finance restoration work on Class 6 ground. The return on investment isn't viable." Elias looked at the map on the wall behind Albright's head. He could see Harlan County from across the room, the ridgelines and hollow drains of it, the Blue Creek lines running down to the Cumberland. "What method did the surveyor use?" he said. Albright looked up. "Standard USDA profile sampling." "At what depth?" A pause. "Short but noticeable. Standard depth. 12 inches. The layer I'm intending to work with starts at 14. Albright closed the file. Slowly, the way a man closes a conversation. "Mr. Combs, we process over 300 loan applications a year in this region. The classification system exists to provide consistent decisions across a large and varied portfolio. Your parcel doesn't meet the threshold for operating credit." Elias stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on. "Thank you for your time," he said. He drove the 93 miles back to Harlan without stopping. He parked in front of the house on Poor Fork Road and sat in the cab of his 1979 Chevrolet C10 until the engine ticked itself cool. Ruth watched him from the kitchen window. She had learned, over 32 years, when Elias needed the silence. She did not come out. When the cab got cold enough, he went inside and started making calls. The Harlan County Public Library on Central Street maintained a collection of agricultural bulletins and extension service publications going back to 1912, bound volumes in the back room behind the microfilm machines, almost never touched. Elias spent 3 Saturdays there in March and April, pulling volumes and reading. He found what he had been looking for, without knowing exactly what he'd been looking for, in USDA Farmer's Bulletin number 1389, published in 1923, titled Terrace Systems for Hilly Lands in the Appalachian Region. The author was a soil scientist named James Willis Collier, who had spent 12 years surveying mountain farm systems across eastern Kentucky, western Virginia, and the Tennessee highlands. Collier had documented in meticulous detail the contour terrace systems used by Appalachian hill farmers, systems he noted bore marked resemblance to pre-Columbian agricultural earthworks found in the eastern woodlands. In a footnote on page 47, Collier observed that the effectiveness of these terrace systems depended not only on the physical bench construction, but on the deliberate incorporation of carbonized organic material, charcoal from field burning, into the exposed subsoil of each terrace floor before planting. Soils treated this way, he wrote, showed dramatically improved water retention and microbial activity over time, and yield on treated terraces consistently exceeded flatland plots within 5 to 7 years of establishment. Elias photocopied the bulletin for 15 cents a page. He drove to Lexington the following Thursday. Dr. Margaret Sizemore was 74 years old and had been retired from the University of Kentucky Department of Plant and Soil Sciences for 6 years. She had spent her career studying Appalachian hill farm soil systems and had published, in 1988, a monograph on soil carbon dynamics in eastern Kentucky that had been read by approximately 200 people and cited by 14. She lived on Nickevisville Road, surrounded by raised beds and the compost operation that occupied most of her backyard and part of her neighbors. Elias had found her number in the acknowledgments of a 1989 extension pamphlet. She answered the phone 800. He explained what he was doing in 90 seconds. She told him to come Thursday. He spread the Collier bulletin across her kitchen table alongside 5 small glass vials of soil cores packed in a shoebox and the hand-drawn contour maps he'd made of the hillside over the previous 2 winters. She looked at everything for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. The carbon incorporation he's describing here, she said, tapping the footnote, is what they're now calling biochar. Pre-Columbian terra preta, the Amazonian people knew this 1,000 years ago. Collier found the same practice in Appalachia in the 1920s, and nobody in the federal extension system followed up on it. She lifted one of the vials and held it to the window. The subsoil inside was the color of old terracotta. Your mineral content in this layer is genuinely good, she said. You've lost the biological layer, the microbial community, the organic matter, the pore structure. That's recoverable. It won't happen quickly. How long? Elias said. She set the vial down carefully. If you do it the way Collier describes, and you're patient, 5 years before you see real production numbers, 7 before it peaks, and that's assuming you don't try to accelerate it. Elias nodded once. He began folding his maps. The extension office will tell you to broadcast lime and seed it in tall fescue, she said. That'll stabilize the erosion. It won't restore the soil. I know, he said. He thanked her and drove home. He spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table running numbers. He wrote a revised plan in a new composition book. Then he closed the book and told no one what he intended to do. He started on April 3, 1994. He did not hire help. He did not rent equipment. He used a 1967 Gravely Model L walk-behind tractor with a hillside plow attachment that had belonged to old Harlan, the chain drive worn smooth but still functional, stored under a canvas tarp in the back of the equipment shed since 1981. Elias sharpened the plow blade himself on a bench grinder, then drove it to Earl Napier's welding shop on Route 38 to have a hairline crack in the mounting bracket repaired. Earl charged him $22. The first task was cutting the terrace benches. He laid out the contours using a hand level and a wooden staff, the same method old Harlan had used on a different slope 40 years before, walking the hillside in slow horizontal passes, marking each bench line with flour sacks weighted with creekstone. Each terrace was cut to a width of 11 feet, with a backward slope of 3 degrees to direct rainwater inward toward the hill face rather than off it. He cut 7 terraces across the 38-acre slope, working uphill from the base, 90 days of labor spread across April through June. His neighbor, Dale Fugate, 61, who ran a cow-calf operation on the creek bottom just north of the property, came to the fence line on a morning in late May. Dale was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, and practical men in Harlan County had a way of saying hard things gently. "Elias," he said, "you're doing $60,000 of work on ground that won't grow anything worth selling." Elias did not stop what he was doing. He was fitting stone along the inner lip of the third terrace bench. Flat flagstone, pulled from the slope itself, fitted by hand so each piece locked against the next. "Probably," he said. Dale shook his head slowly, climbed back in his truck, and drove toward his barn. Through the summer, Elias burned. Elias burned. He built slow, covered piles of crop residue and hardwood slash from the property margins, oak and hickory and a stand of locust that had come up along the upper fence line, and burned them over 2 to 3 days each, watching the piles until they were char and not ash. He hauled the char in a 2-wheel garden cart and worked it into the top 8 inches of each terrace bench, using the gravely fitted with a tiller attachment. The process was slow and unglamorous. 2 tons of biochar per terrace, 7 terraces, sourced entirely from the land itself. By the end of August, he had incorporated 14 tons of carbonized material into the exposed subsoil. In September of 1994, he planted the first cover crop, hairy vetch and winter rye, mixed at a rate of 8 pounds of vetch to 40 pounds of rye per acre, seeded by hand with a cyclone spreader he'd owned since 1978. He walked each terrace in slow passes, the seed falling into the warped soil in a quiet scatter. He did not photograph it. He did not call anyone. October 1994. Thin green shoots covered every bench by mid-month. He wrote the date in his notebook and moved on. Spring 1995. He turned the cover crop under with the tiller and seeded a second rotation, crimson plover and oats, then planted the upper 3 terraces with Cherokee White Eagle corn, an open-pollinated heirloom variety he'd sourced from a seed-saving network in Berea. He planted 23,000 seeds across 6 acres of terrace. The corn came up thin and pale and slow, as he had expected it would. By August, Dale Fugate was back at the fence. "That corn looks sick," he said. "It's alive," Elias said. He said it without irritation. He said it as a fact, because it was one. The corn yielded 31 bushels per acre that first season, far below the county average for good bottom ground, below what anyone would call a success. Elias harvested it himself, shelled it by hand over 3 evenings, and saved 400 pounds of seed. He did not sell a single bushel. He planted it back into the ground the following spring. Winter 1995. He did not sell a single bushel. He planted it. A legal development that provided some practical room to continue. Elias had filed a formal appeal with the FSA on procedural grounds 2 months after the initial denial, arguing that the soil survey used to classify his parcel was methodologically inadequate because it had not sampled below the standard 12-inch profile depth. The appeal moved through 2 administrative reviews over 14 months. In November of 1995, the FSA agreed to a resurvey using a 24-inch profile. The results reclassified 2 of the 38 acres from Class 6 to Class 4, still limited ground, but enough to qualify for a modest operating loan. He received $12,400 in March of 1996. He spent $30,100 on seed stock and the remainder on a 1971 International Harvester 140 Farmall, a narrow-stance, high-clearance tractor suited to terrace cultivation, purchased from an estate sale in Bell County for $18,900. He drove it home on a Tuesday and was back on the hillside Thursday morning. Spring 1997. 4th cover crop cycle turned under, and Elias noticed something as he worked the terrace benches with the tiller. The soil color had shifted, not dramatically, a move from pale brick red toward something darker and more cohesive. Ground that had crumbled dry and powdery in 1994 now held a shape when he pressed a handful. It smelled different, too, faintly mineral, faintly alive. He pulled a core from the third terrace and packed it into a glass vial and sent it to de Grasve, Sizmore's contact at the UK soil lab in Lexington. She called him a week later. "Organic matter is at 3.1%, she said. It was 0.4 when you started." He wrote it in his notebook. He said thank you and hung up. Ruth was at the kitchen counter when he came back in from the phone. She looked at him over the rim of her glasses, the look she'd been giving him for 32 years, the one that said she already knew the answer but was willing to hear it. "Good news," she said. "Getting there," he said. He sat down at the table and began writing the planting plan for the following season, summer 1998. Dale Fugate stopped by in June on his way back from the co-op and stood at the fence for a while looking up the slope without saying anything. The terraces were visibly different now. The vetch and clover cover between the crop rows was thick and green. The corn on the upper benches stood darker and taller than it had in previous seasons. Dale didn't say anything. He drove away. Elias noticed, but he did not remark on it. The summer of 1999 was the driest in Harlan County since 1988. Between July 3rd and August 3rd, measurable rainfall totaled 0.4 inches. The creek bottoms cracked. Hay producers in the county reported losing 3% of their crop to drought stress. Dale Fugate's cows came to the fence lines looking for grass that wasn't there. Elias's hillside terraces did not go dry. The inward canted bench floors held whatever moisture arrived, directing it toward the hill face and into the amended soil below. The biochar-modified ground, now 5 years into its transformation, retained water longer than anyone in the county had ever seen slope soil retain it. On the worst days of the drought, Elias could press his hand into the soil of the lower terraces and feel the moisture still there, 6 inches down. He harvested that summer without irrigation. He pulled 112 bushels of Cherokee White Eagle corn per acre from the upper 4 terraces. He harvested 4,200 pounds of heirloom dry beans from the lower benches, greasy cut-short October bean, and a speckled variety without a recorded name that an elderly woman in Bledsoe, Kentucky, had given him a half-pound of seed stock from in 1996, telling him only that her grandmother had grown it and that she had no one left to pass it to. He did not know its name. He grew it anyway. In August, he sent soil samples from 3 terraces to the University of Kentucky Extension Service Laboratory in Lexington. The results came back in the first week of September. Organic matter 5.8%, cation exchange capacity 19.2 milliequivalents per 100 grams of soil. Microbial biomass carbon 487 micrograms per gram, more than 3 times the average for managed agricultural land in the county. Brian Lawson, 26, a UK-trained extension agent 2 years out of school, processed the report on a Thursday afternoon at the Harlan field office. He read the numbers. He read them again. He called the UK lab and asked if there had been a sample mix-up. There had not. He drove out to the Combs farm on Friday afternoon. He stood at the base of the hillside for a long time, looking up at 7 green-striped terrace benches running across a slope he had walked 3 years earlier on a county erosion assessment and noted in his report as severely degraded, non-restorable by conventional means. He didn't say anything for a while. "What inputs are you running?" he said finally. "Nothing you'd buy from a supplier," Elias said. Brian asked if he could take a core sample himself. Elias handed him the auger without comment. Word in Harlan County does not move fast. It never has. It moves the way it always has, at the hardware store or on Mound Street, at the farmer's co-op on Saturday mornings, at the counter of the Route 421 diner between 7 and 9. By the winter of 1999, the story of Elias Combs's hillside had moved through most of the farming community in the county without a single word of it appearing in print anywhere. Dale Fugate came in late November, a Tuesday. He came alone and without calling, parked his truck on the road shoulder, and walked up through the first terrace with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the ground, looking at the stone edging, looking at the stubble of the bean crop still standing in the rows, straight and full even after the drought, even after harvest. Ilias was sharpening tools in the shed when Dale appeared in the doorway. "I need you to show me the terracing," Dale said. It was not phrased as an apology. It was the closest thing to one that Dale Fugate had in him. They walked the slope together for an hour. Elias showed him the bench construction, the specific backward cant of each floor, the stone edge packing, the way the vetch root systems had knit the inner margin against slumping. He showed Dale a soil profile at 2 feet deep, cut with a spade, dark and layered and living, nothing like the pale clay pan that had been there 6 years before. Dale crouched down and pressed a handful and turned it slowly and looked at it and said nothing for a long time. When they came back down to the shed, Dale looked at the gravely, the worn chain, the scarred plow attachment, the model from 1967. "You did all of this with that," he said. "The model from 1967. And the International," I said. Dale was quiet. "Then, I told you in '94 it wouldn't work." "You did," I said. "I was wrong about it." "You were reasonable," I said. "It took a long time to be right." 3 months later, Dr. Margaret Sizemore submitted a formal paper to the journal Soil and Tillage Research, co-authored with Brian Lawson, documenting the soil transformation on the Combs parcel between 1994 and 1999. The paper, "Recovery of Severely Eroded Appalachian Hillside Soils Through Pre-Columbian Terrace and Biochar Methods, a 5-year field study, Harlan County, Kentucky," was accepted in February of 2000 and published in the journal's September issue. It cited James Willis Collier's 1923 bulletin extensively. It was Collier's first citation in 61 years. Elias received a copy of the published paper in the mail. He read it at the kitchen table. He set it next to the salt shaker and went back outside. Richard Albright on a Thursday morning in April of 2001. He did not call ahead. He drove a personal vehicle, a silver Honda Accord, not a government truck, and parked beside Elias's Chevrolet on the gravel lot beside the equipment shed. He knocked on the front door at 8:45. Ruth answered and offered him coffee. He accepted. He sat at the kitchen table with the manila envelope in front of him, and he was sitting there when Elias came in from the hillside still in his work boots, smelling of soil and cold air. Albright looked older than Elias remembered from the Lexington meeting 7 years earlier. The hair had gone fully gray. Something in his posture had changed. Not broken, but less rigid. A man who had been carrying something and had decided to set it down. "I read the sizzle paper," Albright said. Both times through, Elias sat across from him. "I owe you an apology," Albright said. He did not qualify it. He did not reach for context or institutional explanation. "I dismissed your 1994 application without adequate review. The survey protocol we used was not appropriate for the parcel type. I knew what a Class 6 designation meant in the context of flat land assessments. I applied it to a hillside system I didn't understand. I should have looked harder. I didn't." Ruth refilled both cups and left the room. She did it without ceremony. Elias looked at the manila envelope on the table. "What's in there?" Albright opened it. A set of USGS 7.5-minute topographic maps, 14 of them, covering ridge ground across Harlan, Leslie, Perry, and Knott counties. Red pen circles on 14 parcels, combined acreage 1,340 acres. All Class 5 or Class 6, all showing erosion profiles similar to the Combs parcel in 1904. "There's a watershed management initiative starting in Frankfort," Albright said. "Upper Cumberland River Basin. Erosion control. The standard approach would be to fence these parcels, seed them in tall fescue, and call it stabilized. But the runoff numbers haven't improved with that approach on any of the pilot sites. He looked at Elias. "I need to know if what you did here is replicable at scale." Elias looked at the maps. He traced one ridgeline, a parcel near Hyden in Leslie County, that he recognized from Route 80. He passed it 100 times and thought about it more than once. "It's replicable," he said. "It won't happen fast. I know that, and it'll look like nothing for the first 2 years. That'll be a hard thing to explain to program administrators." "I'll handle that," Albright said. "I need to know how to do the work." Elias pushed back from the table. He went to the back room and came back with a rubber-banded stack of 14 composition notebooks, his full field record from 1994 through 2000, soil core observations, terra specifications, cover crop sequencing, yield data season by season. 6 years of documentation that no one had asked to see. He set them on the table between the two men. "Start with the spring 1995 notebook," he said. "The terrace construction, the first 12 pages." Albright looked at the stack of notebooks. He looked at Elias. "You kept all of this," he said. It was not quite a question. "I knew someone would need it," Elias said. He said it without pride, without edge. The way a man says something he has known for years and has simply been waiting for the right occasion to speak aloud. The Appalachian Hillside Restoration Initiative, formally designated by the Kentucky Department for Natural Resources in the spring of 2003, began its first pilot programs on 3 of Albright's 14 target parcels in early 2002. Elias Combs served as its technical consultant, a designation that came with $24 per hour, and over the following 4 years, approximately 11,000 miles of driving across 4 counties. By 2005, 9 of the 14 parcels had active terrace systems established. The University of Kentucky Extension Service monitored soil organic matter on 5 of the sites continuously. By 2006, the average increase across monitored parcels was 3.4 percentage points, from a baseline mean of 0.6% to 4.0%. Hillside erosion rates on treated slopes fell by 78% compared to adjacent, untreated ground. 3 farms were producing marketable crops by the 4th year of their terrace establishment. Heirloom dry corn, dry beans, and specialty squash sold through the Lexington Farmers Market and the Berea Artisan Market. Dale Fugate converted 19 acres of his own ridge ground to terrace cultivation in 2003. He came to Elias's farm 2 afternoons that October and walked the method through from the beginning. The contour laying, the bench cut, the stonage, the char incorporation. By 2006, his 19 terrace acres were producing more per acre than any flat ground in his operation. Richard Albright presented the initiative's 5-year results at the Appalachian Land and Water Conference in Berea, Kentucky, in October of 2007. He spoke for 22 minutes. Elias was in the audience, seated next to Brian Lawson, 4 rows from the back. Albright's presentation included the project's full history, including the 1994 loan denial, his visit to Elias's kitchen in April of 2001, and what he found on that kitchen table. "When I walked into that farmhouse," Albright told the room, "I had spent 6 years believing that the decision I'd made in 1994 was correct. The man I had turned away had spent those same 6 years doing the work that proved me wrong. He had documented every day of it, every soil reading, every cover crop, every terrace bench. And when I asked for his help, he handed the documentation across the table without bitterness and without condition. I've thought about that morning more than once." He paused. "What he used is not a new method," Albright said. "It's older than any agency in this room, older than any classification system we use. We just stopped looking at it, or we never started." Dr. Margaret Sismore, seated in the 3rd row at 87 years old, nodded once and said nothing. Elias had stepped outside by then to check the weather. It had been a dry October. He wanted to see whether rain was coming before he made the drive home. By the autumn of 2008, the hillside above County Road 421 looked nothing like it had in March of 1994, and everything like it had in some older time that photographs could not reach. 7 terraces ran across the face of the slope in long green arcs, their stone edges fitted by hand, their floors dark and dense with living soil. The 2 spring seeps below the ridgeline ran clear even in August now. The creek at the bottom of the parcel had not run red with sediment in 4 years. The deer came at dusk to graze the field margins. Elias, 72 now, walked the terraces on a morning in late October. He was cutting the last of the bean vines from the lower bench, rolling them into windrows to be turned under before frost. His knees ached more than they used to. He moved more slowly. He still moved. He stopped at the 4th terrace and pressed his hand flat on the soil. The way old Harlan had done it, once on a different hillside not 2 miles from here, on a summer afternoon in 1961. He held it there. The soil was cool and faintly moist and smelled of something deep and alive, something that had taken 14 years to come back to itself. Ruth called from the back porch. Lunch was ready. He pulled his hand from the soil and stood up slowly and started down the hill. The ground remembers, not as a comfort, not as a promise, as a fact about the physical world, the kind of fact that does not require belief, only patience, and the willingness to work without the assurance of a result. The kind of fact that institutions cannot classify and banks cannot collateralize, and no survey, at any depth, can fully capture that what looks ruined is often only resting, that what looks irreplaceable is sometimes already present, waiting beneath the thing that replaced it. That the old ways do not become wrong simply because newer ways arrived. He walked down through the terraces, through the dark and living soil, toward the smell of coffee and the sound of his wife's voice. The 1967 gravely sat in the shed at the bottom of the hill, rust at the seams, chain worn smooth, the hillside plow attachment resting against the wall where it always rested, ready as it had always been, for whatever the ground asked of it next,